Revelationary on Air with Brian Knapp and Dr. Chris Bolt.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Getting a little echo there on somebody's speaker. This is our first live stream. If you can't tell, we're having some technical issues that we've been working over the last half an hour. But you know what? We're laid back, we're calm, we're cool, we're informal. We're just here to chat. Is everything working for you guys okay?
Yeah, I feel like I'm the shortest on the screen. I look like a midget.
It slightly reminds me of a photograph that we are not going to mention on air.
No, don't go there.
Showed up lately, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess we're live. We should probably start this thing. So I'm Brian Knapp, and with me is Chris Bolt. We are Revelationary and Revelationary on Air, I guess is what we're calling this now. And between us, we have Eli Ayala with Revealed Apologetics. Eli is our guest this evening. And very much like when I was on Eli's show a couple weeks ago, we really don't have anything planned. We're just we're just going to talk. We do have some ideas of things to talk about. We'll give Eli a chance here in a minute to just go through and give a little bit about his background and what he's up to. And definitely, I see some of you are already putting questions in our chat, which is great. I think what we might do is just end up kind of doing a roundtable once we get through the introductory stuff. And if you have a question that's specific to one of us, make sure that you specify who the question is for. If you don't specify, I'll just assume it's for any of the three of us that want to take that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Tell me, Eli, what got you into apologetics? Give me a little bit of your background.
Well, my background involves growing up in church. I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up going to a Spanish Pentecostal church with really, really, really long services. So our services were like 2.5 hours to 3 hours long. I used to joke around and say that Jesus left the service before the service was over. So the sermon would still be going on. Jesus would be in the back door. I'll see you next Sunday. It was a very long time. And I had church Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays, 2 services on Sunday. So we had the 2.5 hour sermon and service in the morning, and then we would come back from 7 to 9:30 in the evening. And interestingly enough, because it was a Spanish-speaking church, I never actually caught on to Spanish, which is sort of embarrassing. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking home, but I mastered Spanglish. So my dad would speak to me in Spanish, and I would respond in English. So it took me a while to kind of catch on. And so what I did, as soon as I was able to read, I had this little, NIV Bible under my banco. We called it. We had these wooden benches, which were very uncomfortable. I think they were purposely created so that you don't fall asleep in church. But I had this little NIV Bible, and I just picked it up and read it. And I did that for years, since I was super young, all the way up until I was in my early 20s. And through my years of just reading my Bible and having conversations about, the things of God, I began to just really fall in love with history, the Bible, theology. When I would have sleepovers with my cousins who also went to my church, we'd watch a movie, and then we'd stay up late just talking about the things of God, whether it was, spiritual matters that were of a practical import, or they were kind of intellectual things like, how do we know A, B, C, D, whatever the issue we were discussing. And so I really grew up in the context of the scriptures, a love for the Bible. I always believed in God. I kind of, if I can get a little subjective here, this is my experience. I've always just felt this overarching presence in my life. So it's not that I hear voices from God or anything like that. But throughout the course of my life, there was always just this presence and this just knowledge that like he was there. And when I pray, he was listening. So I had a relationship with God as far back as I can. I don't even know specifically the date when I became a Christian. As far back as I remember, I believed. And so growing up in that bubble of the church I grew up, my family, things like that, it was when I went to college where I stepped out of that bubble for a brief time, and I took a course called Literature of the Bible. And it was supposed to be a class on the Bible as literature, but the first 20 minutes to a half hour of the class, the teacher would ridicule the Bible and talk about how the Bible, was not the word of God because there were contradictions in it, things like that. And for the first time, I was challenged to think outside my bubble. And so I did a little experiment. I pretended to be an atheist for a short while and did some research as to what are some of the arguments, even apart from what the teacher was bringing up, what are some arguments against the Bible, against Christianity? And then I would go back into my Christian perspective. And I told myself, listen, Christianity's been around for over 2,000 years. Surely someone has, responded to these things. And long story short, that introduced me to apologetics in general. And then my introduction to presuppositional apologetics is a different story. I can unpack that later, but that's kind of in a nutshell.
Very cool. That's great. So tell us a little bit about Revealed Apologetics, what you've been up to lately with the website. I guess you have some classes you offer in addition to the shows that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the website has my blog. It also has, my isolated videos that are part of my live streams when I'm on YouTube. And it has an online course there that I teach, consisting of 5 lectures with the PowerPoint notes and outlines and things like that. And folks could sign up and take those courses in 2 ways. I have a basic option in which people can go on the website right now and pay for the course, take it at their own pace. And then there is a premium option that I'm actually going to be starting on June 1st, where if people sign up now until then, they'll get everything in the basic package, plus meeting up with me weekly through a Zoom meeting, and we just unpack everything and go into greater detail. And we've already done it with a set of students already, and they loved it. We had a great time. And at the end, to kind of put to test what they were learning, I called my good friend Matt Slick to play the devil's advocate with the students. And so they had to kind of use what they were learning. And Matt Slick from CARM, he's really good at pretending to be an atheist. So we had a really interesting and fun time. But folks can sign up for that if they'd like by going to revealedapologetics.com. And it has a blog as well. So I write articles. I don't write long articles. I'm trying really to keep things simple for the average person, so that we don't get bogged down into some of like the endless philosophical distinctions that we get. I want to write to the average person who says, hey, what do I do when a Roman Catholic, approaches me? How do I presup a Roman Catholic, And so I'm trying to kind of address those issues more on the popular level. And I'm a busy guy, so I don't have as much time as I would like to write more in-depth stuff. But that's what I'm doing now, and I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, we appreciate your work for sure. We started years ago to try to popularize presuppositionalism a bit more, as far as writing for the common person and disambiguating the terminology and eschewing I can't even say it. Eschewing obfuscation and these sorts of things, right? No, but really, we were trying to kind of put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as they say, with choosing hats in particular. And I think that we were, at the end of the day, I think we were successful in that goal. And presuppositionalism has changed a lot since then. In the way that it's been received and its popularity, all of those sorts of things. And so you got really this popular level presuppositionalism that went all over the internet as podcasts and videos like what we're doing became more and more popular, new social media and whatnot. And then also at the same time, you had, I believe you've had more presuppositionalists in the academy and in the literature. That really started with, now I don't know how to pronounce his last name, if it's Ryder or Reader, but David R. at Erskine. And he wrote a piece that was critical of the transcendental argument in Philosophia Christi. And kind of ever since then, we've seen more and more articles in scholarly literature regarding the transcendental argument, presuppositionalism. So really kind of two worlds there that have both grown a great deal over the last 10, 15 years. but we really appreciate what you're doing, and I think that you're kind of taking the next step in doing that. One of those things, and I'll kind of ask a question along those lines then.
Well, before you ask a question, if I could interject, I just want to say that years ago when you guys had Choosing Hats and you guys were active, I learned so much from what you wrote, especially that blog series that you did, Chris. I still go back to it and try to capture, how can I kind of just summarize and simplify this idea or that idea? And I've learned so much, and I would imagine a lot of people learned from what you had to write there. So I'm very, very, very grateful for what you guys have done over the, all those years ago. So just wanted to share that.
We appreciate it, and we're glad to hear that. I guess what I want to ask you, and we've talked about this a little bit when you had me on your show, is regarding, what do you think the current state of presuppositionalism looks like as far as the whether on the internet or off the internet, as far as, are people taking kind of a hard line stance with presuppositionalism, or do you think that some of the criticisms have been received well and we're kind of adapting it? I know that we've talked a little bit about the use of evidences, the use of other argumentation, having a kindred spirit with other apologists from other schools and that sort of thing. What's acceptable there and what's not acceptable? And where do you see yourself in that scheme?
Well, it depends where you look. If you look in the dark corners of the interwebs, presuppositionalists have a horrible reputation. And in some quarters, they're just not taken very seriously. A large part of that is due either to misunderstandings of what we're arguing. And of course, I wouldn't put the entire blame on just presuppositionalists. There are people who just don't listen. Okay. And they bring up all sorts of, my favorite is when people bring up these, objections to presuppositionalism as though they're making some great, perceptive point. When all that stuff has been addressed in the literature. If you just read a Bahnsen book or Van Til or Frame or something like that, it's addressed. But I think the large problem with presuppositionalism currently today is really our public relations. We tend to just be snarky, not gracious, very quick to call everything a heresy. It's kind of that cage stage Calvinism sort of thing, where when you learn presuppositional apologetics and you're convinced that this is the biblical way to go, we have no mercy for those in the other camps who are doing great scholarship. They just happen to disagree with us. And while we think they're wrong and those disagreements are important, that doesn't devalue what they're doing. And that's actually the reason why on my own show, I tried to mix it up a bit. I want more presuppositional apologists on, but I do try to mix it up so that people can see what the other methodologies have to offer. And even when I'm interviewing someone who might be an evidentialist or a classicalist and a presuppositionalist is listening and saying, wow, this is horrible. You know what? If you think the evidential approach is horrible as presented by some of the folks who are on my show, that's a learning opportunity to say, you know what? I see what he's doing and I see why I wouldn't do that as a presuppositionalist. That's instructive too. And I don't need to backbite or call someone a heretic or a compromiser because they disagree with me on apologetic methodology. I just wish we can get past that. But unfortunately, I think that's the current state of presuppositionalists. If they were interacting with gentleness and respect, I think they would be given more of a hearing. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people have done that. Now, myself, I tend to be a nice guy. I get along with most of the people that I interact with. And what I've been encouraged, I'm not patting myself in the back, but it's just proof that it's possible that because I've respected those that I've interacted with, I've even had people say, well, I completely disagree with presuppositionalism, but I want to hear more from this guy. And you know what? That's mission accomplished, right? The lines of communication are open, and get this idea out of your mind that because God is sovereign, I'm going to stick by my guns and God, listen, God is sovereign. The Bible is his word, but we have to understand that doing apologetics biblically doesn't simply mean to use the sort of argumentation that does not allow man to put God in the box, so to speak, on the dock, so to speak, but it also includes the manner in which we engage. And you have on the internet these awesome presuppositionalists who have these really sharp arguments and they're biblical, but the manner with which they share it is unbiblical. And for some reason, it goes right over their head, and the conversations are, they close down, and we get a really bad reputation as a result.
Yeah, that's especially important, I think. We don't have to bow to the spirit of the age. We all know that. And yet at the same time, there's a sense in which we need to contextualize, right? We need to approach things in order to communicate clearly to people and be persuasive. I know some people act like that in and of itself is a problem. But some of the things that I've seen in you and what you do, I do think that you're a humble person, which I very much appreciate. You're teachable.
Oh, stop.
And
stop, Christopher. You're making me blush.
You're teachable, and but you're also a gifted teacher. And I like that. I like that you're not afraid. So there are different senses in which I say that. One is because you have convictions, and yet you're compassionate and you're kind in the way that you put those convictions forward. You avoid both like this fear of some sort of cancellation, which is so popular nowadays, right? But then also you kind of stay out of the politics of a lot of the things going on out there, so that you're able to have guests on various ends of the spectrum, and guests who, some of them are very popular, some of them are not popular at all, some of them may come with some sort of controversy or some sort of thing like that. And you manage to just steer perfectly through those things to get what you can out of your guests that's helpful, useful for an apologetic endeavor, whether it's presuppositionalism or something else. And so that's one of the things I really appreciate about your show and the way that you're approaching all this. I mean, I think that really I guess this is weird in a way, because we didn't necessarily bring you on the show just for me to heap praise on you, but I do want to encourage you. You're doing what needs to be done as far as interviewing these guests and whatnot. You have great guests on there. You're bringing, like, if I knew how to do technological things, that's why I have Brian around, right? If I knew how to do these things,
he's
that's
the most
exactly
quiet. Yet his picture looks better than everyone else.
I know.
Notice is doing all the talking now.
Well, once we're wealthy, once we're as wealthy as atheists think we are from doing this, I'm going to get myself a new camera. So, one time at Choosing Hats, we kept getting accused of like doing all this stuff for selfish gain or whatever. So we posted our income. We didn't post our expenditures, but our income was zero for every month, since we started the site. We didn't post how much it actually cost us to run that sort of thing, what it costs to do this. But anyway, no, I really appreciate all that. I wanted to try to get a question out of that, but I don't know what question to ask.
Well, I got a question.
Yeah,
I
go
got
ahead,
a question
Brian.
that kind of goes along with that. Eli, I've followed your YouTube channel for months, and how do you get all of these guests? I mean, you've gotten some pretty big names in apologetics. What's your secret?
Well, my secret is coronavirus. That sounds a little weird, but let me explain. First, the kinds of guests that I have are just, I ask myself, if I could sit down and talk with someone, who would it be? Who would I ask the questions that I have for myself? And these people come to mind. So if people do enjoy those conversations with those various guests that I've had, that comes from a genuine desire to ask the questions, even questions that I know the answers to. How would this person word it? How would a Chris Bolt answer this specific question? So I invite guests on that I really just, if I had an option to just sit down with someone and talk with them, like, yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with Doug Wilson, with Scott Oliphant, or Chris Bolt, or whoever. Now, the reason why I've been able to get them, and in such a short succession, I remember when I first started getting a good, stream of guests, and people were saying, "Who is this Eli guy? He's getting all these people on his show," and people messaging me as though I have these connections or anything like that. And when someone asked me the question you just asked, I'm like, well, the only reason why I'm able to get these people is because of the coronavirus. Everyone was home. When I was, messaging Dr. Oliphant, I asked him, hey, would you be willing? He's like, I'm home. Yeah, fine. Yeah, I don't mind, So everyone was home because they were quarantining right towards the beginning when all this stuff started happening. And their schedules, their traveling schedules were canceled, and I was able to get a bunch of people. And then when things started getting a little bit back to normal, I started losing a little bit of steam, but I think I've established myself enough that I can get a good, I have some contacts where I can reach out. I actually almost had William Lane Craig on, which would have been fun. Wow. Because I had Kevin Harris on, who is the guy who interviews him on Reasonable Faith.
Yes.
So he connected me and I almost had him, but I mean, he's so busy, obviously you would imagine. Yeah. And so that's really the reason why I've been able to get all the people that I've been able to get on is because, coronavirus, and I just reach out to people. When we think of actors like Hollywood stars, we tend to think of them like, oh my goodness, this is a huge celebrity. I would know, I'd love to meet this person or that person, and I would never be able to do that. When you're in the world of theology and apologetics and you're reading all these books, we tend to stand in awe of these authors and like, oh my goodness, it's like it's Doug Wilson, it's Wayne Grudem. They're not movie stars. They're professors at like seminaries. Like if you were nearby, you can visit the seminary and say, can I talk to so-and-so? So I figured if I have a question for Wayne Grudem, let me call the school. I called the school and I was able to talk with him. And he came on for, an episode a while back. I have it on my podcast. So it was just a mixture of the schedules that were all messed up for people because of COVID. And because I just reached out to people and said, hey, would you like to come on? And people were so generous with their time. And so that's how I've been able to get all these different guests on.
You've still gone from back in the day, it would have been like 2 presuppositionalists that you could have on. And now it's like 20, 25 or something like that. And you've got all the good guys, like you've done your research to be able to know who it is to bring on. So a question then to follow up on that, because you were talking about, well, you've slowed a little bit or whatever. Well, the
not
question
that much.
Well, the question becomes,
I got some tricks up my sleeve still.
Yeah, and that's my question. I mean, where do you see it going in the future? Because you're not, I mean, I guess you do have enough guests that you could just continually have them on again and again or something like that. But what are some of the things that you're thinking about doing yourself on the show? Or you've got your academy or whatever. You're going to develop that some more. Are you looking at publishing, or what are you looking at there?
Well, I want to create more courses. So in terms of the overall YouTube channel with the interviews and stuff like that, I was really encouraged by someone who I spoke with. They said, Eli, I really love your show. You're kind of like the Puerto Rican Justin Brierley. If you know Justin Brierley, I was like, okay, that's really cool. He's a really good interviewer. I'd like to think I'm a good interviewer. It's like, maybe I can keep this thing up and kind of have that sort of format. But my ultimate vision is to just as say like someone like R.C. Sproul, right, wanted to promote Reformed theology, because in it, he found the gospel of grace and the transforming power of the gospel and the Reformed tradition, that he began to popularize, this. And of course, he was part of a larger movement, but he spearheaded a lot of it in our day. I wanted to do something similar to that with presuppositional apologetics. I mean, personally, thinking presuppositionally, being impacted by people like Van Til, Bahnsen, and even yourself, Chris, it's one of those things where when you understand, like, look, I have a truth here that can be revolutionary to the church, and so I want to get it out there. That's my big goal, is to get it out there as best I can without doing it in the kind of cage stage mentality. Right. So I'm happy that people think I'm the nice presuppositionalist. Like that's a badge of honor. I wear it with honor, because there's so much bad stuff out there that it really gives this beautifully biblical apologetic a bad name. And I want to, in my own way, and I know I'm not the only one doing it, but in my own way, I want to kind of reverse that and be more respectable, but at the same time, show the power of presuppositional apologetic methodology, and in my own weaknesses where I'm unable to show its strength in certain areas, to have guests on to expand on areas that I'm weak in. Okay, that's the number one reason I have certain guests, because I want to ask them questions that perhaps I need help unpacking. You know, the problem is that it is very difficult for me, and this has been my experience. It is very difficult to get Reformed people. The easiest of my guests have been the evangelical Arminian Molinist guests, you know, hey, Frank Turek, hey, oh, come on. Hey, you know, but when I get the Reformed guy, it's like, it's a lot of work. I mean, these guys are so in their own, like, it's the OPC. It's like the church is like, oh, that's just that on. It's like, it's hard to get a lot of the top-notch Reformed people out. And what I want to do is I want to take some of these very sharp Reformed thinkers who are not out there in the popular arena and bring them into contact with the average Joe. That's why I had someone not apologetic related. That's why I had someone like Guillaume Bignon on, the French philosopher and determinist. I mean, he's an excellent defender of Reformed theology from that philosophical perspective. But I mean, the average Calvinist who's debating online and trying to share their views, they don't know about him and they're not going to read his book. So to have him on the show, I was able to kind of put him in contact with the average person, and they can kind of toy around with some of the ideas and have a little bit of ammo when they're trying to defend the Reformed tradition or give some philosophical defenses to various objections. So that's my vision, is to put all this stuff out there the best I can in the unique way that caters to the kind of personality that I have. And hopefully that will just add a little bit to the work that other people are doing.
He's also a very nice guy, by the way.
Oh, yes.
I've met him several times, but in person.
And he's hilarious. We text back and forth. He is there's the 2 or 3 people who are my favorite text friends. They just text the most funniest thing. I like laugh out loud. He is a very funny guy.
Well, Brian, you need to ask another question before I crack an OPC joke. So I don't want to do that. So go ahead. It's about their numbers, but anyway.
So I'm curious, have you thought at all about writing?
I want to write so bad. It is the thing that gives me anxiety. I want to write so bad, but because the family and my kids are very young, it's just, and the way I think, I need to be in isolation. I need these blocks of time to think and put my thoughts out. I'm a better speaker than I am a writer. So when I write, it's something I really need to spend a lot of time in. I'm just not at that stage in my life where I could go as in depth as I would like to go. So the goal is to write. And for now, I'm keeping my articles very superficial and kind of just addressing certain questions that I get. But hopefully down the line, perhaps I could, continue writing the book I was trying to write. And I have a couple of, I've started it, but I had to put those things on pause just because it's not the right time in my life to really buck down and get that done. Although I'm looking forward to when things open up for me in that regard.
Yeah, that's good. How did you want to do this, Brian? Are the questions ones that Eli is supposed to answer, or are we all going to answer them or discuss them? And
so for those who are watching right now, I see a couple questions have come through. If you have a question for one of us in particular, mostly Eli, since he's our guest, you can talk to Chris and I pretty much any episode. Just go ahead and put it in the comments there. I'm just gonna go ahead and scroll through here and see what kind of questions we're getting.
Chris is smarter than I am, so if I don't know a question, then I'm totally gonna just punt it off to him.
I might.
Here's one from Patrick.
If we get one too tough.
Here's one from Patrick. I'm not sure if this whole thing is going to fit on here. Yeah. Okay. So Alex Malpas claims the proponent of tag might need to refute an infinite number of worldviews, since there are more than one distinct non-Christian worldviews. So the question here is that when we're using tag, one of those premises is that there are at base only 2 worldviews: Christian theism, as Van Til would call it, and non-Christian theism. And the question certainly comes up a lot of times, but there's more than one non-Christian worldview. In fact, there's more than one Christian worldview, depending on how you want to define worldview. What would you guys, either one of you, I mean, I have something to say, but I'll read the questions and you guys can answer. How's that? So either one of you, what do you want to,
Sure. Bahnsen has addressed this, and in my opinion, I think he's addressed it sufficiently. That when we give the transcendental argument, and I think, Chris, I've had you on the show and you've addressed this, that if the Christian worldview does in fact provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, for knowledge, things like that, then if it's sufficient, it's also necessary, right? That if it in fact provides the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience, then it follows it must be true, since part of its claim, part of the Christian system's claim, is that it is the only worldview that can provide that. And so if it is one, then it must be the only one. If there's another one out there, then that means the Christian worldview isn't one, because there is a conflict within the system, namely that it claims to be the only one when in fact that's not the case. So if we can demonstrate that the Christian worldview does in fact provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience, knowledge, or what have you, then it follows that it must be the only position. Now, that's not a silver bullet response in the sense that once we say that and demonstrate that all of a sudden the atheist explodes and disappears and has nothing else to say, right? That's going to require some hashing out. And so we could provide some examples, a positive case, if you will, as to how the Christian worldview does in fact provide those preconditions. So we'll have to kind of dig a little deeper there, but that's how I would address it. I don't think that it is the task of the transcendental argument to refute every single worldview through some kind of like inductive method of doing so one by one. Because of the nature of the argumentation, I think once you demonstrate that it's sufficient, then you've also demonstrated that it's necessary.
Yeah, in one respect, presuppositionalists are cheating. If I recall correctly, in the 5 Views on Apologetics book, the one edited by Cowan, I believe, I think now it's been many years since I've looked at that, but I think that Habermas criticizes Frame for, incorporating an entire worldview into his response. And Frame basically said, yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm presupposing the entirety of this worldview, not merely a particular tool or system or something like that. It's the whole thing. And in that sense, it looks like we're cheating, but that's the gist of it. That's what we're saying. We're saying, no, you accept this view on faith, and it gives you the necessary and sufficient preconditions for intelligibility or intelligible experience. And the opposite of it, whatever that might look like, is still the opposite of it. Mm-hmm. And it does not provide the necessary or sufficient preconditions for intelligibility. So that first response that you gave, Eli, regarding the sufficiency of the Christian worldview is good, because the Christian worldview does claim that it is in and of itself both sufficient and necessary. And so I'm not going to rehash what you already said there, but I would also say that philosophically speaking, if the Christian worldview is sufficient, if it's demonstrable that it is sufficient, then you've also established its necessity along philosophical lines, because in the transcendental exchange itself, there can only be one transcendental. We're not talking about a particular feature of a worldview. We're talking about the entirety of the worldview. So
the whole enchilada, as Greg Bahnsen used to say.
Yeah. The guys on the Van Til list didn't like that response very much, but the whole enchilada, as Bahnsen said. And yes, I had Mexican today, by the way.
Me too.
Good, yeah. But anyway, it's, even if you have a localized transcendental argument, that's the case, that you're establishing the sufficiency of this one precondition. And so we are expanding that to cover the entirety of a worldview, whatever that is. That's a whole other episode when we talk about that. Right. And then the second part of the reply then regards what's called the transcendental premise, or the negative transcendental critique, which would be focused on the denial or the negation of whatever we've said positively about the Christian worldview, right?
Sure.
And so we're looking at a non-Christian view. The thing is, in the nature of the case, it's not as though there's some third position. The third position would itself be non-Christian, right? So it's not as though we're inductively going to come to some truth in the future that falls outside of this scheme. That doesn't make sense, right? I've had people try to use multi-valued logics or dialetheism or something like that, and try to deny, the principle of explosion, try to deny the law of non-contradiction, and say, well, you've got more than just these two options or something like that. But guess what? That is another non-Christian scheme that they're offering in an attempt to refute Christianity. So we're back where we began again, because the classical logics are still going to hold in that regard. Anyway, so when you're looking at the transcendental premise, then that's the one that does most of the work, right? That's what we usually see in presuppositionalism. And you can say, we can give a hard response like I did and say, look, to refute one is to refute them all. That's what Bahnsen replied, right? Because they all share this in common, that they're non-Christian. That in reality, they're autonomous, right? They're about self-law or self-rule. They're not based, they're not predicated on the authoritative revelation of the Christian worldview. You could throw out, world religions, but for that, I would direct you to the podcast episode that Eli did with me, actually, on Precept with World Religions.
Which was a very good episode. I've listened to multiple times.
Even when you go, and of course I'm rusty on these things, but even when you go into like some inductive look at this, like let's say you take a soft approach and it's abductive, you're still going through and refuting these different views. Gordon Clark did a wonderful job of demonstrating the problems with a lot of these worldviews, and his followers have as well. Even in other apologetic methodologies, people have done a very good job going through and showing what's wrong with each of these views. Bertrand Russell was Greg Bahnsen's favorite philosopher because Bertrand Russell held virtually every position there is to hold philosophically during his lifetime and refuted them all. Essentially, he pointed out what was wrong with them. David Hume likewise. You get into these guys who are doing the work for us as far as showing the problems here. And what Brian's going to want to say is what, Brian? At the end of the day, when you're talking about all these things philosophically anyway, it comes back to what? I know you know what.
Oh, it comes back to the authority of Scripture.
Well,
taking it on
comes
faith.
Back to where are you standing, right?
Right.
Come on, pay attention, Brian. Pay attention.
It's not like we're outside of the system. This is why we quit the site. We used to be
question was ambiguous, Chris. It was ambiguous.
Well, you've known me long enough to know that happens too. But
yeah.
But it's funny to me that you never get this level of critique with other methods, right?
Yes.
So
it goes much deeper, which I think is a plus. It showed there's a much more depth to the conversation. When I hear classicalists debate atheists or evidentialists debate atheists, you can get into the details of the evidence and arguments, but the way I look at it, they're always skipping on top of the water, and there's this whole host of unaddressed issues in the debates because there are these hidden assumptions that never get addressed, and if they are addressed, they're never addressed with any depth, in my opinion.
So let's move on to another question here. Here's something from Team Taco Slick. I don't see a question in here, Taco.
It's a statement, a
it
dogmatic
looks
assertion.
Like you're begging the question. Just an assertion, yeah. So let's actually find. Here we go. So Brandon's got a good question. What's the easiest way to explain to everyday people how the problem of the one and the many disproves Unitarianism? So I guess from an apologetic perspective, how would you even talk about the problem of the one and the many with an everyday? I guess he would mean by everyday person somebody who's not involved in apologetics or philosophy. But what do you guys think?
Well, I think there's something, in my opinion, there's something in the issue with the question. What is the easiest way to explain? People is like, well, give me a shortcut. Well, not so fast. I mean, when we do apologetics and we talk about its all-encompassing nature and its nuclear strength form of argumentation, I mean,
in one sense, it makes our task easy, but that doesn't mean all of the issues that we need to address are necessarily easy. It's very difficult to explain one and many metaphysical principles to the average person on the street. There is no, quote, easy way, because the difficulty with which you're going to explain something to someone is going to depend upon where they're at with respect to what they know, their background information, and things like that. So I wouldn't try to find an easy way in general. I would tether my responses with regards to this topic based upon the person I'm speaking with. And then you're just going to have to make a judgment call, in my opinion, as to what are some easy ways to draw out, what is the one in the many problem. You're going to have to, you're dealing with metaphysics. I mean, that's a complicated topic. And it's typically not something the average Christian is going to come in contact with when they're, defending the faith at the dinner table or, on the street somewhere. So I would say that with that specific issue, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and get a little deep. If the person's asking those sorts of questions, then you need to dig into them. I wouldn't bring this up to the average person. In other words, I'm not going to be in my mind determined the one way I'm going to prove the triune God of Scripture lives, right, is I'm going to get into the issue of the one and the many with this random guy in the street that I'm going to witness to. I don't think that's the best route to go. There are easier ways and simpler ways to make your point than to jump into the deep water of metaphysics that have been really a difficult topic ever since the pre-Socratics. I mean, the issue of the one and the many is not something presuppositionalists have thought up. I mean, this has been a problem throughout the history of philosophy. And unless you're speaking with someone who has the knowledge of the history of philosophy, it really becomes irrelevant to bring it up. I think in most cases. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting and powerful about presup, especially if you're making use of the transcendental argument, is you can use that with whatever they give you, right? And whoever you're talking to, you don't have to necessarily drive them towards the problem of induction. That's what I used to use all the time. Mm-hmm. Chris remembers this. It was one of my favorite to try to explain, because it's not easy to grasp for everybody. But you don't necessarily have to, like you said, drive the conversation towards something that you feel really excited about. It's more about listening to what they're saying and taking something that either they have explicitly said, I don't believe that there's any absolute morality. Or if you can pick up by, that they're implying something, it doesn't always have to be explicit, and then just ask them that question. So is what you're saying, whatever, and use that as a jumping off point. That when I've done this in person, that's what I typically do, because if somebody's bringing up something to you, it's probably because they want to talk about it, right? And the great thing about presup is you can use anything that somebody says, that somebody asserts, that says, this is the way it is, or this is true.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if the question pertains to Unitarianism in the sense of theism or deism or something like that, or pantheism, or if it's referring to Unitarianism in the sense of a Unitarian or a monistic view of metaphysics or the world or whatever. In reality, I mean, you're dealing with the same thing either way. So you can borrow here. This is one of the things I appreciate about presuppositionalism. You can borrow from the work that philosophers and classical apologists have done. So, for example, I think that the problem of divine loneliness in philosophical theism applies to Allah, for example. And so you can use that argument, bring that out. That's a part of your toolkit as a presuppositionalist to bring up the problem of divine loneliness. We don't have that issue in Christian theism because we believe that there is one God who eternally exists as three persons, and each person is truly God. And so we don't have the problem of divine loneliness. They shared glory with one another. Apart from everything else, apart from creation itself, they shared glory with one another. You can also bring up the issue of the grounding of love. Now, you're going to tweak that a little bit if you want to get into serious presuppositional and transcendental level apologetics. But nevertheless, something like, how do you ground love? Is it actually grounded in who and what God is? Or does a deity depend upon its creation to be able to love? If you don't have these three persons or plurality of persons in God, then it's difficult to figure out how exactly that God can be essentially loving apart from his creation. So that deity becomes dependent upon creation. Now, philosophically, that problem of the one and the many obtains with regard to a deity like Allah, because at the end of the day, Allah, and I've been saying at the end of the day a lot, so I apologize. I'll try not to say it in future episodes. But at the
fact of the matter is,
that was literally his next sentence.
No, but really, the difficulty here is one, for example, of how Allah can even know particulars. How can Allah know Muhammad, the prophet? And there are Muslim philosophers and Sufis who have dealt with this question, and they actually go the route of something like divine emanation. It almost takes on a panentheistic or pantheistic feel. And the reason for that is that there's no way, if Unitarianism is the case, there's no way to differentiate between particulars. Okay, and so that is how Unitarianism is addressed. It addresses itself. It's a self-referentially problematic view. I apologize, it's late. And Unitarianism can't account for manyness or plurality, right? So you can't even predicate something of a subject, for example. There's no plurality there to speak of. It's all unity. It's all one thing. A way you could drive that home, practically speaking, is through the problem of evil. Because in Eastern religions, for example, that are pantheistic, that believe that all is one, Atman is Brahman and Brahman is Atman, whatever, everything is one. There's no way to differentiate between good and evil then. And that's a problem for those who actually are acquainted with suffering or evil or that sort of thing. We don't have these problems in Christianity. And so you could go on down that road. One thing I would caution against, a lot of people believe that, and I've made this mistake myself for sure, that we think of the unity of God as pertaining to universals and the plurality of God as pertaining to particulars. That's true, but it reoccurs on every level of thought. That is not what Van Til is saying. That's definitely much more of a classical approach, but that's a little bit more nuanced than I can get into right now.
Yeah. Okay. And all of that presupposes background knowledge such that all of this would make sense, because the average person on the street is not even going to know. Not only are they not going to know what the one and the many problem is, they're not going to even know that there is a problem called the one. It's like I don't see the problem. So I don't think it's a very practical topic to get into.
I think you could make it practical. I mean, this problem does exist, for example, even in graphic design, with the wholeness of whatever you're creating, the image, and then the many different features, that sort of thing. I mean, it exists all over the place.
Sure.
Francis Schaeffer addresses this in a very practical manner, but it's kind of like a mystical response that he gives.
Sure.
But one thing to realize too, when we're talking about induction, when we're talking about logic, when we're talking about morality, when we're talking about anything, we are still actually talking about the problem of the one and the many. We're just not explicitly talking about it in those problems.
Right. Gotcha.
Cool. So, hey, I want to read a paragraph from this book here, which is an amazing book, Survey of Christian Epistemology. I've noticed a couple questions about Van Til and revelational epistemology. So chapter 1, this won't take very long to read. Just bear with me. So Van Til writes, according to Scripture, God has created the universe. God has created space and time. God has created all the facts of science. God has thought according to which it is to operate. In the facts of science, God has laid the laws of being according to which they function. In other words, the impress of God's plan is upon his whole creation. I'm on page 1, by the way, Eli.
Okay.
Second paragraph, we may characterize this whole situation by saying that the creation of God is a revelation of God. God revealed himself in nature, and God also revealed himself in the mind of man. Thus, it is impossible for the mind of man to function except in an atmosphere of revelation. And every thought of man, when it functioned normally in this atmosphere of revelation, would express the truth as laid in the creation by God. We may therefore call a Christian epistemology a revelational epistemology. The reason I read this, I've been involved in quite a few discussions lately, and I think you have as well, regarding the question of autonomy. And Chris, you mentioned it earlier. So do you guys want to talk at all about when Van Til talks about neutrality and autonomous reasoning? Is it even possible to reason autonomously? Is it either or, autonomous or not autonomous? Or is it the situation that we can reason in an autonomous manner, or we can reason in a different manner? Mm-hmm. All of this is driving back to what it means to think Christianly. So what do you guys think about, when you hear the term, autonomy, autonomous thinking? What are your thoughts on that from a precept perspective?
Well, first I have to brag a little bit, because that's a great book, by the way. But within arm's reach, I had my Van Til signed copy of Defense of the Faith. I was able to get my.
Yeah. Well, I know. I've got this, so.
I happen to get this bad boy from a friend who is an old OPC pastor who knew Van Til, and he hooked him up. It's got a bunch of the highlights in it and everything, so it's super cool, man.
Is that one signed though?
Yeah. I don't have a physical copy of Chris's book. I totally have to get one.
Team Taco Slick has a signed copy
of your book.
Of that one, yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I'm halfway through it, by the way. It's very good. Autonomy.
Okay, question.
Yeah. Okay. Autonomy. So can you summarize the question more? So you're asking me what I think about autonomy. Is it possible to be autonomous?
Yeah, what I'd like you to talk about is from a precept perspective. How do you introduce, or how do you talk about autonomy in the way that Van Til and Bahnsen spoke about it? What does it mean to you to say we shouldn't reason autonomously, or we can't reason? I want to get your take on it, because I have a particular take on it, which, based on some recent discussions I've seen, isn't necessarily in alignment with them. So.
Well, when I think of autonomy, I don't think autonomous reasoning is possible. There is same thing with neutrality. Van Til and Bahnsen would speak of a pretended neutrality. We speak as though we're neutral, but in reality, we're not. We can reason as though we're autonomous, but if anything in which we're doing when we're reasoning would makes any sense at all, it's because the world is the way God has created it. So it really is wrapped up in this idea of suppressing the truth for the unbeliever. If you are a covenant breaker as opposed to a covenant keeper, what characterizes the covenant breaker is that he does not acknowledge the source of his reasoning. And so he tries to reason independently from that source. And this is very much wrapped up, and Van Til spoke about this a lot, wrapped up in what we see in the Garden of Eden, right? Where you have God's command not to eat from the tree, and you have the serpent's suggestion that, God is wrong. If you eat from it, you're not going to die. You're going to be like God. And so instead of relying upon the revelation of God, Eve steps back and says, I will determine what's right in my own eyes. Now, of course, she could only do that in any meaningful sense because she lives in God's world, right? So she's now actually not functioning in a way that is consistent with the way the world should be, the way that she should be reasoning. So when I speak of autonomy, when I think of it in terms of the Christian walk, to try and reason autonomously, number one, is impossible as I see it. And number two, it is to not acknowledge the fact that we exist within the very context and environment of God's revelation. And so it is to, I would say, when done consciously, it's sinful to reason in a way that does not acknowledge God as the only context in which something like reasoning even makes sense. And so
I think it's a good opportunity to talk about within the context of the church. We can use scriptures, for example, where the scripture says, bring every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I think that is, in a sense, of course, the Bible's not speaking of autonomy, issues that we're talking about now, but there's a principle there. Bring every thought captive, even the thoughts that you try to think of that you think you can make sense out of independently of God, right? We need to bring those thoughts captive as well. And that the difference between the believer who seeks to do that and the unbeliever who's not doing it is that we are relying upon the very source that we profess with our mouth, and we're seeking to reason in a way that's consistent with that profession, right? That we're covenant keepers, not covenant breakers. We do not want to reason like covenant breakers, because that is the reasoning of Eve. And that's a great example, I think, of the sort of reasoning we shouldn't try to do. Number one, it's impossible. And number two, it doesn't honor God. So that's how I think about it.
It sounds to me like there's maybe two different, from what I'm hearing, there's two different ways to interpret this question. One is, at the end of the day, sorry, Chris, is it actually possible to reason in a world that God has created without depending on God, right? In other words, we don't have the ability to reason outside of the world that God created for us. In other words, we are not literally in the real sense autonomous when we reason, because we are depending upon the facility that God has given us to reason. We're depending upon our ability to interact with the world around us, to gather evidence, to hear different arguments, those types of things. But on the other hand, I think it is possible to reason in an autonomous manner. And when we do that, we are not letting God be our ultimate authority. One of the examples I've used before is my dad passed away a number of years ago, and my mom took it really hard. And I remember her and I were sitting talking one night, and I think he had been dead probably for 3 or 4 years at that point. And she said, Brian, I really think God should have taken me earlier. I don't see the point. I don't see the reason that I'm here. And, my first, after talking through, the loneliness she was feeling and what it was like to live without the spouse that she had lived with for over 50 years. On the one hand, I could understand what she was saying, but at the same time, in the back of my mind, I hold to the fact that God is in control. He's sovereign. He has a plan. And so when my mom says, it would have been better for me to die years ago, I understand what she's saying. But the scriptural approach or response to that is no, what's better for you is what God has planned for you, because that's what scripture tells us. So to me, that's the difference between reasoning autonomously, in other words, not taking God's revelation to us into account when we reason, versus, putting ourselves under the word of God and allowing him to speak to us and integrating what he has told us into our reasoning process. And I think the latter of those two is what we should be attempting to do as Christians, and what we should be attempting to do when we talk with individuals is to get them to understand that there's a right way and there's a wrong way to reason. Do you guys see the distinction that I'm explaining between those two?
I think I would still stick by my guns that autonomy is an attempted autonomy. Neutrality is an attempted neutrality. But I don't think that when someone is, quote, reasoning autonomously, that he's actually doing it successfully. Because for anything within his reasoning process to even make any sense at all requires the necessity of the environment of revelation. It's just that he's suppressing it. So I don't think he suppresses it with success, because the revelation of God is inescapable. So I would still say that autonomy is something that is professed. People can try to reason along those lines. They may think they're reasoning purely in autonomous categories, but even in their attempted autonomy, they are presupposing God's revelation. And that's just part of the whole, the critique, the transcendental critique there. We demonstrate, well, actually, Mr. Unbeliever, when you think you're arguing autonomously, you actually have to borrow certain categories
of the Christian perspective to even make sense out of your attempted autonomy. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, that phrase over and over again is would be autonomous reasoning, right? Yeah.
Yes. And that would be is huge. And this is the annoying thing about Van Til, is that you can read something and you'd be like, oh, wait, that doesn't make sense. But then he always qualifies some of his statements with like these little words that if you pass them over, you miss the entire point. Right.
You know, I think that, and I mentioned that to Brian, I think recently on another episode, that, you know, you get, I mean, look, I've got 2 degrees in philosophy, so I'm not the brightest guy in the world. I'm not the best philosopher in the world, but I can read philosophy and understand and know what they're saying and know the difference between good and bad philosophy and all that. And, you know, when you read Van Til, he's not just broad brushing like people say. He is, because he's a continental thinker and he's writing in from that tradition and whatnot. And it's a Dutch Calvinist tradition. I mean, he sounds like Bavinck to me, or Kuyper. I mean, they write in a similar way, but Van Til is very careful to nuance the discussion. You know, when he says something like, well, you know, we don't have any common ground with the unbeliever, and you think, whoa, and then he'll say, well, we have all things in common with the unbeliever. You know, and you think, well, is this guy crazy? You know, what's the problem here? He's being unclear. He's not being unclear.
You might disagree with him, but he's not an idiot.
You need to read the rest of the context, because he goes through and specifies what he means. You know, there's surface level agreement, right? There's, what does he say? Formal agreement, but not material agreement. He talks about, you know, epistemological common ground versus metaphysical common ground versus psychology. I mean, he addresses all of those things. It's not as though he was unaware of the objections and whatnot that might be brought up, or is not setting it out there. I think this, I'm not going to answer that question per se. I think you guys did fine talking about this a little bit, but I would like to see more work done in the area of the internalism and externalism discussion. This is in a book somewhere. I might have it nearby, but I'm not going to turn around and look for it. But anyway, I can't remember the name of it.
You don't want to be that guy. Wait a second, I got it.
I can't remember the name. It's an article in a book, and it's sitting behind me somewhere. But anyway, you know, he tries to address that internalism, externalism thing. We're talking about justification versus warrant and all of these sorts of views. You know, the thing is, Van Til did not deny that an unbeliever has knowledge. I mean, he did affirm they have knowledge. It's just when you press on that, there's no way to account for that whatsoever. So, and I think that that's the case, not just in an internalist understanding of knowledge, but in an externalist understanding. So you get into transcendental arguments and refutations of unbelieving thought when you get into guys like Alvin Plantinga or Tyler McNabb, right? I mean, he's doing great work right now regarding, you know, he's expanding Plantinga and some of his argumentation into dealing with world religions, addressing world religions and where they go awry epistemologically, because they affirm different things, even metaphysically, in some places. So I think there's really something there. I think that Van Til is correct, and there's more work that needs to be done, even as philosophy has developed some. You know, that internalist and externalist thing accounts for some of the things that Van Til is saying about the nature of the unbeliever's knowledge.
Yeah. You mentioned also a common misconception where people kind of thought that Van Til said the unbeliever doesn't know anything. That criticism is so wrongheaded. I have in front of me here, I have my phone. This is from the Popular Encyclopedia of Apologetics by Ergen Canner, the great scholar, and I think it's Ed Heinsohn or something like that. And there is a section there on presuppositionalism. And in the section on evaluation, after they kind of lay it out, here's what it says. Of course, this is on page, if people want to, page 403. It says,
so close to home here, but go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, are we running out of time?
No, that's not it. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Just ignore Chris.
Okay, so it says here, quote, of course, it should be understood that presuppositionalism comes in several flavors. Cornelius Van Til was quite radical in his teaching. He essentially denied that lost men could know anything significant at all. That's from an apologetics encyclopedia. That's not Van Til's position. So you have people who should know better, and the people who should know better promulgate this sort of stuff, and then people who don't know any better take this stuff, and then you have all this misunderstanding on what Van Til was saying. Yeah, and I think that's why Bonson's work was so important. Good.
Yeah, I think maybe what might drive some people towards that is Van Til does talk about atheists. There's a difference between knowing things and knowing things truly. And I think what he's referring to there is when he introduced the word truly, he's talking about going and looking at all those things that are back of would be the terminology that he would use. So yeah, he would say unbelievers know things, his famous, they can count, they just can't account for counting. I think draws the distinction between knowledge and true knowledge.
Okay.
So yeah, Cantor didn't write that part, but I'm not going to get into the backstory of all that.
Good. Let's move right along. Taco has a question here. Instead of talking about food, what is the first item you would address when talking with a Mormon? Either one of you guys, why don't you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. It really, again, it's going to depend on the nature of the discussion, because Mormons can start from a bunch of different areas. I mean, I've talked to more philosophically inclined Mormons and sat there for 2 hours in a public library talking about, metaphysics and how can polytheistic Mormonism ground something like the universal conceptual laws of logic. I mean, that was a very fruitful discussion that we had, but that's not definitely the route you're going to take with the average Mormon. I would say, and I think Bonson would agree, that a helpful way to interact with the Mormon is to find common ground. Now, before I speak of common ground, there is a distinction to be made between what we would call neutral ground, which doesn't exist. We don't believe that there's neutral ground between believer and unbeliever, but there is common ground. And with respect to those who piggyback on the Bible, I would say that the Bible is common ground. If you're talking to someone who believes that the Bible is the authoritative word of God, run with that. Show them this is what the Bible teaches. This is what Mormonism teaches. There's a conflict. Oh, no, there's no conflict. Our prophets say A, B, and C, and you work with them with the scriptures. Oh, there's translation issues that's why your Bible says that. Deal with those issues. Talk about the evidence, right? The presuppositionalist doesn't have to run straight to a transcendental argument to interact with the Mormon. I would say know your Bible well, know how to defend the Bible, and interact with their specific interpretations and try to show a conflict between what the Bible says and what their prophet says. And they're going to have their own presuppositions. They're going to have their responses. But if you argue effectively, we pray that God uses your words to kind of break through the barrier and prick the person's heart and bring them to the truth. And it's possible. People say, oh, well, they have their interpretation. So, right? Everyone has their interpretation. It doesn't mean we can't reach them, right? Especially if God is working in his spirit. You defend the word of God faithfully, know your scripture, know how to defend it, and show that tension within their perspective, because we know it's there. That the Bible that they want to affirm is actually in conflict with the wider body doctrine that they hold. And you want to press those points and press them good so that you kind of leave the Mormon with a pebble in his shoe, so to speak, by the time you guys end the conversation.
Yep. So here's a question from Dylan. It kind of goes back to what we just mentioned, but when Van Til says the unbeliever cannot truly know things, what does he mean? Is he merely saying the unbeliever cannot justify their knowledge that they actually do have?
Yeah.
So
go ahead. No, go ahead. What were you going to say? I didn't want to interrupt you.
I was going to say, I think what he's saying, what Van Til is saying there is true knowledge is knowledge that you have provided justification all the way back to God, or all the way back to some beginning that can provide the preconditions for the world that you live in for it to be intelligible.
Sure. Yeah.
So that would be my take on what he means by truly. If he's just talking about knowledge, from a Van Tilian perspective, he would grant unbelievers that they can have that kind of knowledge, more proximate knowledge than ultimate.
Yeah. So you take a look at the concept of a cow. I think the unbeliever can look at a cow and tell me what a cow is. But and in a sense, he knows what a cow is. But does he know a cow truly?
if a cow is a created thing, and the fact that it's a created thing is part of what it is, then does the unbeliever know what a cow truly is? Well, in that sense, no, he doesn't, because he's leaving out the very thing that gives the cow the meaning and reality that it has, right? So he could know there's a cow crossing the street. You know, we're stuck in traffic. Like, oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today. There was a cow. He was crossing. There was traffic. It was terrible. He could know a cow in that proximate sense, but in its true sense, as a created thing, right? He, in his denial of God, he doesn't know the thing truly in that sense, I would say.
So in a discussion with the author of that piece you cited earlier, the pushback on that was, okay, sure. So the cow was created versus, oh, the cow was not created. Isn't this just trivially true? Like, isn't this just trivially the case? Like, what difference does this make, or what impact does this have upon the apologetic endeavor or epistemology? How would you answer that?
Well, again, to know something truly is a big deal. If you don't know the metaphysics, if in other words, when I take a word in a sentence, right? How do you know what that word means without context? You know, I can say, okay, I think the word means this, but if you don't know what the word means in the broader context, if you don't have the broader context, you don't really know what the word means. You can give me kind of a loose and fast definition. Same thing with worldviews. If you're operating under a false metaphysical context, do you really understand what the individual facts within your worldview truly are? I mean, we could talk about them in poppy because we have to communicate, but do you know what a cow is as it relates to the system? I think that's a huge problem. If you don't know the metaphysical situation that gives meaning to the individual particulars, the facts, then do you truly know what they are? On a practical level, yeah, we can talk about it. And if the other person doesn't want to argue about it, you know, those foundations, we can kind of communicate. But do you know what a cow is truly, independent of the context that makes it make sense? Do you know what anything is? When someone says, I think, therefore I am, I know that I exist, well, what is I, independent of a context of reality that gives the I its meaning, its definition? You see what I'm saying? So I would say that without knowledge of the ultimate context, you couldn't have a true understanding of the particulars. We could have agreed upon ways to talk about them, right? Just like Van Til says, unbelievers can count. They can do math. It's not like you don't understand math because you say, I don't believe in God. No, but you can't account for those things. We can talk about a cow. We can go to the store and we can buy milk and we know where the milk came from. And, they come from cows. It's a wonderful thing. But to know a thing truly is to know it in its relationship to the broader system that gives it meaning. And so if we really want to get into those deeper issues and really get beyond even allowing or even beyond allowing, granting the unbeliever a knowledge of the things he takes for granted, if we really want to get him, let's go to that ultimate issue, the ultimate metaphysical foundation upon which all derivational facts come from. If you don't know what that is, do you really know the specific fact, that derived fact? I would argue you don't. And I think that's very relevant to the apologetic task.
So you wouldn't say that the unbeliever don't have a cow, right? Or
yeah,
or I don't know. Or we're talking about
come on, man.
Talking about holy cow because this is Van Til. I don't know. Anyway, okay. There's a lot of cow talk there. I'm getting hungry. So.
There's a lot of cow talk. So actually, Eli, I'm guessing this from the correspondence section of Van Til's survey of epistemology. Is that right? The cow story. Because Van Til talks about.
Yeah, most of the stuff that I've learned is through listening to Bonson lectures and Van Til lectures, and I've read. He's used Bonson has used the example of cows, and he uses all these wonderful examples of like Huey, Dewey, and Louie, the ducks in the pond, to talk about universals and particulars. I don't think
Bonson wrote that, but yes, go ahead.
Well, but that's where I heard it from, and those little examples I think are helpful in trying to explain in very simple ways some of these broader, more technical philosophical issues.
Yeah, I thought of that earlier when you're talking about the one and the many and putting the one and the many on a easy level.
That's I forgot about that one. I suppose we could use the Huey, Dewey,
pushing the antithesis, and it talks about Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So there's three particular ducks, but they're all ducks, duck, universal, right? Although again, anyway, that's a different story.
Yeah. I suppose you could talk about the one and the many in more simpler categories. I didn't really think about that. If you're really interested in learning how to talk about that in simpler ways, I think you should really listen. Whoever asked that question, listen to some of the old Bonson lectures. He was a really good
teacher, and he simplified a lot of these complicated issues. So everything I've learned, they're all free. That's right. So I would highly encourage people to check out the Bonson Project. Go to, download the sermon audio app. I'm sorry.
Right. No, I was just going to move on to the next question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
If you want to.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
You guys are breaking up on me.
I'm hoping that was the polite way of saying, shut up, Eli. We got to move along.
He's saying, don't have a cow.
Well,
I won't have a cow, I promise. I wanted to milk that one a little longer.
How do I get you out of here?
We need to move on.
Remove you from this.
Oh, dear.
Okay. So, Chris, your face is turning red. You're cracking yourself up. How do we know we can trust the Bible wasn't just made up by some guy? This is a question that Taco gets from junior high students all the time.
Yeah, well,
suggesting
the possibility that the Bible was made up by some guy is not an argument. You see what I'm saying? It's like, yeah, maybe the Bible was written by a unicorn. Like saying that.
No, it's a question.
But that's what I'm saying. That's how I would respond. I mean, I've had middle school students tell me this very thing, and I'd say, give me an argument, because I'm ready to show them that the truth of the Bible, the reliability of the Bible is defensible in a factual way. Notice what I'm doing now. I'm not running down a transcendental, route with the junior highs. I could say that the truth of the Bible is that if you deny it, I can talk about that if I want. But this person is really asking a question that I think would be better addressed by just talking about the facts of the evidence of the Bible. And if some of those deeper presuppositional issues come up, then you address them. But I would say, hey, it's made up by some guy. What argument do you have there? It's like, I don't know, maybe it's just made up by some guy. Okay, well, here's some reasons why I think it wasn't made up by just, some guy. Number one, the Bible was written over a period of 14 to 1500 years over on 3 different continents in 2 different languages, but written by over 40 different authors. I mean, this is a historical fact, even if you don't believe the Bible's inspired. So you don't just get away with saying maybe it was, check this out, written by or made up by some guy, singular. We know it wasn't written by one singular guy, and we have multiple reasons or multiple ways we can demonstrate that to be the case. So when someone brings an objection, and even when it's just a genuine question, well, how do we know? Don't think that the weight of demonstration falls on your shoulders all the time. Ask somebody to support their claim, right? It's like, well, this could have happened. Cool,
right?
And so, what's your argument? That's how I would address it.
It's one of the things I was sharing with my students last week. So many so-called objections to Christianity, so many of the arguments so-called that you'll get into, people are merely making assertions. There is no argument there. Right. When people say, well, your God is a fairy tale. I mean, this is completely, there's no evidence. There's no reasoning there. It's just name calling. That's all it is. Right. And so it's worthwhile to point that out, or just make the opposite assertion. Be like that scene. Well, anyway, I don't want to get into copyright infringement or something, but anyway, just make the opposite assertion. Well, your God's a fairy tale. No, he's not. He's real. There's no argument there. Assertions back and forth. But I think with that question, I think you did a good job, saying we know this is not just from one guy, and we need to talk about the nature of Scripture. And like Brian and I mentioned in a previous episode, so many people attack the Bible upon this presupposition that's a faulty presupposition or assumption that the Bible is written merely by men. We do believe that the Bible is written by men, but not merely. Right. It has God as its author. It's inspired. So,
yeah,
for sure. All right. Let's see if I can find another question here.
There was a good one a minute ago. I can't find it, but there was something that got thrown around on Twitter earlier in the day. And actually, I would like Eli to address this one because he's up on current events and things like that. So as I recall, I think this is how it went down. I may be missing some steps here, but James Anderson of Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, he posted and said something to the effect of Van Til needs better critics. And then I think he was the first one to say that. And then Dr. Jordan Cooper, who is a Lutheran theologian and pastor, really great guy, he tweeted something to the effect of, is there anyone in a question for Van Tillians? Is there anyone who's a Van Tillian who can talk about a critic of Van Til without saying that they misunderstood him or misread him or whatever? Now, there are certainly many, many cases that I have found myself saying, just like we did earlier with the example you gave. I have found myself saying, this person has misread Van Til, this person has misunderstood Van Til, this person is misrepresenting Van Til, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me as though it happens a lot. So can you think of a person or an argument or whatever that is directed toward Van Til that is not subject to that type of criticism of, oh, well, they just misread it? Because obviously what people are thinking is these Van Tillians are just making this up. Like, if you can't have a guy who expressed himself in such a way that he could be clearly understood, then what good is he, right?
But you know, some of these criticisms really give strong evidence that they haven't dealt with like the actual material. So it's, to be perfectly honest, I can't think of anyone who's got it like, yes, you've captured it, you know. But if I'm going to say that's a great criticism, then I would be granting them that, yeah, Van Til's mistaken on this some key point, and I don't think he is. But to be perfectly honest, I have not seen someone who has accurately represented, even someone like Richard Howe, Dr. Richard Howe, which I greatly respect. I think he's a great guy. I actually had a very well, no, I didn't have an interaction with him. He gave me a nice little shout out at some conference, which I thought was cool when they were, you know, around the table, and my friend sent it to me. So I know he's aware of the stuff that I do, but I've listened to a lot of his criticisms, and he tries to be fair. I think he's trying to be fair. But to be perfectly honest, in his respectful demeanor, in his attempt to offer criticisms as you know, based upon his best understanding, he still doesn't get it. There are things that are just easily answered with just a deeper look, or maybe, well, this is what Van Til meant when he said this, and you're not really, you know, allowing him to speak there. So to be perfectly honest, I mean, I have yet to meet a person or read a person that properly represents the specific area that they are critiquing, and then offer a good critique. I'm sure maybe there's someone out there, but I'm just telling you from my experience. I
want to toss this over to Brian too for his view, but I did want to comment on Dr. Howe because you brought him up, because one of my answers was, I mean, Dr. Howe comes to mind as maybe being the closest.
Yes.
I just off the top of my head, I can't really think of any. But with Dr. Howe's objection there, and he's been making the same objection for over a decade.
Sure.
And it pertains to metaphysics and epistemology, and that we're conflating those two or something to that effect. Dr. Anderson has written a reply of sorts to that line of thinking. But Dr. Howe, in his discussion, I forget the name of the channel. It was a massive YouTube channel. He was in a debate on methodology with Dr. James R. White.
Mm-hmm.
And
he said that he disagreed with the response. Dr. White brought it up.
Yes. And so I'd have to look into that a little bit more and see what's going on there. But I think Dr. Howe is functioning off of a very different framework when he comes to this. I've interacted with him just a little bit at a conference pertaining to, he was speaking on Oliphant and Aquinas. And some of the definitions were, you know, there were ships passing in the night, even in that. So yeah, I think he's the one who made a comment on, is it Cameron
Bertucci's The Capturing Christianity?
I think he made a comment that Plantinga is not doing epistemology, and that completely threw me for a loop. So I'm convinced that we're talking past one another somewhere.
Yeah, William Lane Craig said in one context that Van Til wasn't a philosopher.
Well, that's a whole.
I was like, come again? I mean,
that's a whole different story. Brian, what do you think about that criticism, though? With that, we can't name a critic that we think is fair. So there must be something wrong with Van Til.
No, I mean, I don't. For me, I think I mentioned this in my interview with Eli. It took me many years to get it. Now, I'm
Sure.
not the sharpest tool in the shed, so that's understandable. But I think at least those people that I've read that are criticizing presuppositionalism are doing it based on something less than reading Van Til and even Bahnsen. The majority of the ones that I've interacted with have been responding to things that internet presuppers have been saying,
Right.
Which is, to me.
Well, Brian,
I mean,
if I could interrupt you real quick, if you've watched the interview with Cameron Bertuzzi and Richard Howe, Cameron, mentioned Seitan Bruggencate as though he was kind of the standard epitome of like, this is what presuppositionalism is. It almost like he was unaware of, some of the more better representation. And I say that with all due respect. I love Sai, and I love what he's done in the past. But there just seems to be an ignorance from the other side as to what quality presuppositionalists have to say, in my opinion.
That's our fault.
I guess, Chris, I would say the same that Eli says. I can't think of an example of someone who's criticized him fairly.
I can't think of examples, but then I want to reply to my answer. So I believe that people within Van Tillian circles or loosely affiliated with them have actually made decent critiques that at least don't misrepresent what Van Til is saying for the most part. So I think that David Byron is an example of this. I think that Michael Sudduth is an example of this. I think that Sean Choi is an example of this. I think that who are some of the other ones that I've named before? Oh, I cannot remember at the moment. But I mentioned like 5 people. Paul Manata would be another example.
Yep.
James Anderson to some extent. John Frame. Yeah, and I'm leaving out one more. If we have Paul on, we're going to pull that clip right there that you just said, and that's how we're introing the show. And then you two can go at it, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy. Okay.
Yeah.
But Paul Manata?
Paul Manata.
No, I wouldn't mess with him, man. I've been trying to get him on my show for some time.
He's a busy guy. He's a busy guy.
Yeah, he is.
But I do think that they've come up with some of the best critiques, but they're functioning within Van Tillian circles, or were. And I don't think that that's something wrong with the method. Now, I want to push back on that and say that in essence, because we are presuppositionalists and we're talking about how does the Bible apply to the apologetic endeavor, how do we spell this out philosophically? We're simply, in the nature of the case, going to say something like, okay, if there's a problem here, it's because we've misunderstood something with regard to how the Christian worldview applies to this particular issue. And so I think it's just something in the nature of the case with the presuppositional method that leads us to some of those things. In addition to, I don't think that people want to wade through Van Til. There's a lot there. The big, the analytic, the reader that Bahnsen wrote, I mean, that's a rite of passage for Van Tillians, but a lot of folks are not willing to even read that, much less dig through
that. If I could, I mean, people are always interested in what I'm reading. I have to say that is my favorite apologetics book. Is this book is Bahnsen's Van Til Reader. I've learned more presuppositional apologetics from this than any other book. This is my go-to book. I highly recommend.
But it's hard work, right? It's hard work to get through some of this stuff.
It's
hard work to do it on your own, I think.
Yes.
I think it's much better to be involved with and have. That's how I started Presup, was in a discussion group with 2 or 3 other guys. And we got through a lot of it. Some of the basic stuff, I still had issues with. My specific problem was giving up the Christian worldview, which is like the cardinal sin, right? As it were. That's not what you do when you're arguing presuppositionally, but it was so different from the kind of reasoning I was familiar with. And that, I think, might be a contributing factor as well. It's a different way of approaching this topic, or any topic for that matter. And I just wonder if it isn't, a cultural phenomena that we see as well, where people, it's so different from what we're used to thinking a different way of thinking about things.
Yeah. And I think in the time where people don't have time to read thick books, I would love to do an audio book of Bonson's books, or even this one, like this one. I wouldn't mind reading an audio book, doing the voice for this. This is such an important book and would help so many people. And I know myself, I don't have time to like plow through this thing. I think
there's a project right now going on specifically for that.
For the book?
Well,
I've actually been in touch for taking Bonson's book and creating audio recordings.
I emailed them. They asked for volunteers. I ain't got no email back.
Is this okay? So is this through PNR?
It's going to be the same one that I'm.
They already have Always Ready out, right? It's is that the one?
They have a couple different ones.
Theonomy. Yeah. They have a theonomy. I mean, they said email if you want to be a reader. I did that a couple weeks ago. I mean, I got the voice, I got the microphone, bro. Come on, man. I'm ready, dude.
Let's see. I'm just looking through the questions here. Okay, here's another one from our favorite type of food, taco. What is our point of contact with the unbeliever if there is no neutrality?
That they are image bearers of God, and that there is an element of God's revelation that even they cannot escape. And so our job is to expose the fact that even in their denial of God, they must rely upon him because of that very fact, is that they are image bearers of God, and the very creation itself is the environment in which they exist. It's revelatory. And so our job is to expose that reality with gentleness and respect, but pressing the issues that this unbeliever in his denying God is actually relying upon him. And then we'd have to draw that out and show why that's the case.
Right.
Very good.
Well, so where are we at? We're right at an hour and a half. Do you guys want to try and wrap things up here?
It's up to you.
I'm
down.
Anything else
anything else you want to? What's that?
Anything else that Eli wanted to touch on?
Yeah.
Well, nothing specifically, although I was going to ask Chris something, but perhaps I'll ask him after the show to see if he'd be willing to do something. But I don't want to put him on the spot now while they're recording.
I'm used to it.
He's like, whatever, man.
Patrick asked something earlier about evidentialism. I think we're probably going to devote an episode in the future, Lord willing, to the problem of evidentialism, the evidentialist problem. This idea, well, how can you believe in God if there's no evidence, or something like that? Patrick asked an interesting question regarding, if we believe that everything is evidence for the existence of God, then how do we address W.K. Clifford's view that it's wrong for anyone, anywhere, at any time to believe anything upon insufficient evidence? And so I think there is a unique response from a presuppositional angle on that, but it will still fall in line with a more Reformed epistemologist response. But we can address that in a future show, Lord willing. That's a big topic.
I do see someone mentioning Revealed Apologetics swag. Yes, that is actually in the works. My wife was designing a really nice black hoodie sweater with the logo. It actually looks pretty fresh. So when that comes out, yes, cool. You can wear Revealed Apologetics swag. So
awesome.
Excellent. Well, Eli, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half with us. It was great to have you on. Same with you, Chris. I guess it was good that you were here.
Thanks for coming on, Eli. As I hope you can tell, we think the world of you, and we appreciate everything you're doing.
Well, I appreciate you guys, and you guys have been a great blessing to me back in the day when I was reading your material, and you're continuing to be a blessing to me. Just the very fact that we are able to connect like this. I never thought that I would ever be doing a YouTube episode with you guys. I've known about you guys for a while, and it's super cool to have the opportunity. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. Well, I guess with that, we will wrap it up. And to all of you who've been watching, we appreciate it. And if you watch this after it's posted on YouTube, feel free to go ahead and interact in the comments section. Just keep it clean. And we will see you in our next episode. Thank you.